G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to talk to you guys about how to stop your knees from clicking. And the way that I'd like to structure this video, excuse me, is that I want to go through it in sort of three sections, with the first being, I guess, a discussion around why knees click in the first place. The second thing we're going to touch on, which piggybacks off that idea a little bit and is a common misconception, is that I want to sort of touch on why knees that click aren't necessarily related to arthritis or joint dysfunction. And I think that's a big misconception around clicking knees, where we default to this idea that it's based on damage or wear and tear or degeneration. And the third thing that we want to touch on, probably the most important part of the video, is I want to go through 4 exercises to hopefully help you guys solve the problem, to stop your knees from clicking. And within those 4 exercises, the first one's going to be a really powerful, highly effective and fast acting symptomatic exercise, where after you do the exercise, you should definitely expect to feel some change, whether it's an audible change, a physical change, in how that knee feels to move and be used. And the 3 extra exercises on top of that are going to address the original concept that we're going to talk about in a second, and hopefully get at the root cause of why that knee wants to click in the first place. So before we get into it, as always, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing if you really enjoy this kind of information, and let me know with a like if you enjoyed the video as well. And also down below in the comments, let me know how your knees are going at the moment. Do you have knees that click? And if so, how long have they been clicking for? What's your impressions of it? And let me know what these exercises do for you guys after watching them. So as we get into it, the first thing that I want to touch on briefly is why knees click in the first place, and then tie that into why it's not necessarily related to arthritis, wear and tear, degeneration, etc. So basically, we did a video a couple of weeks ago surrounding sort of clicking ankles, and I'll link that up here for anyone interested. And it's the same concept where ankles that click or knees that click or pop or crack, it's a mechanical dysfunction. So the natural order of the tissue of the knee, and for most people, I'm sure you'll agree, a lot of people tend to have knees that click towards the outside, where a lot of soft tissue meets the kneecap. Some people feel like their knees click sort of underneath the kneecap, and then obviously there can be some sensations or some audible sounds coming from sort of the inside of the knee as well. But what we need to remember is that the knee is often a joint of consequence, in that it's not necessarily this isolated, separate structure floating around in space. It's physically and literally connected to the ankle below and the hip above, and it's directly impacted by the function of those areas. And we can often see that when we look at something as simple as a squat, in that when we squat, if you're someone who squats and have your knees come in a little bit, that can often be a sign of three things. You can have a little bit of ankle restriction, where as your knee bends, it sort of runs into the end of your ankle range. So what happens is, instead of having the capacity to keep going forwards, it runs into a restriction and has to dump inwards and change direction. The second thing we can see the same thing happen at the hips, where as you are squatting or moving, instead of being able to keep your knees out and function correctly, if your hip's a little bit stuck where you don't have that full rotational capacity of the hip, again, you get to a point where it gets tight, and then it has to dump inwards to work around that restriction that you may have. And the third thing which ties into this is, in terms of glute strength, being able to keep those knees in a good position. So your hip muscles externally rotate your legs with a fixed foot without your feet turning out. Feet straight, externally rotating your knees is done by a lot of the muscles in your hips. So often when we're missing those 3 things, or one of those 3 things, or a combination of all of them, the default position that we can get into is one where our foot sort of turns out a little bit and that knee tends to want to dump inwards. Now, the reason why this is important to understand is that the knee itself is just caught in the middle of all this. So if the knee is designed to function best with your foot straight, a well-stabilized hip, and when you squat it might look something like this, where your knees tend to come out a little bit, then essentially if it can't do that, then the way that you're loading up that tissue becomes different. And then over time, what can happen is we can get a selection of tightnesses, restrictions, overloaded areas of the knee that can change mechanically. Things get stiff, things get tight, weaknesses influence things like a puppet, and we can start to get tissue that starts to flick and click and crack and pop. And I guess to tie this into the arthritis comment is that it's a common misconception because it's not to say that if you have a clicking knee that you don't have arthritis, because again, as we've discussed previously in a video surrounding arthritis and all those noises that people get, is that it's very unlikely that the arthritis is the cause of that clicking and cracking. And the reason why we know this is that when we get to the exercises in a second, you can do these exercises and change the clicking and the cracking almost immediately, or in some instances, in a very short amount of time, a couple of days, a couple of weeks, depending on the person. So, and in those moments, doing these exercises doesn't change any arthritis or any wear and tear behind the kneecap or in the knee joint itself. It just changes the way that you load that knee. So again, just to reiterate, if you have an audible sound effect or some clicking that happens in your knee, that doesn't necessarily mean that arthritis is causing that or joint dysfunction is causing that. Again, it's not to say that you don't have it, because you may well have it, but I guess the broader conversation here is that those dysfunctions are unlikely to be the cause of that clicking and cracking, which means it's something you can change. So again, when we're getting to these exercises, we want to make sure that you've got something that you can rely on to help change the symptoms and make you feel better immediately, while also working on the broader issues that I talked about before. If your ankle's stiff, you can't necessarily have a healthy knee, or at least the potential for a perfectly functioning knee. If your hip's a bit tight or your hip's a bit weak, then again, the way that you load your knee up is going to be different. So you can spend a lot of time doing these exercises that we're going to go through, or at least the next one that we're about to touch on. And if this is the only exercise that you do, you'll have to keep having to do it, because the other issues are going to keep asking this area to be dysfunctional. So again, we need to pair these things up together with the broader understanding of how to improve the way you load your knee to fix this clicking for good. So the exercise that I highly recommend anyone does, and you can use any ball is fine here. You can also use a foam roller, but for the purposes of this, I think a ball works really well. Now, and this is for any type of knee clicking. So if you feel like there's some clicking behind the kneecap, if it's more of like a lateral click towards the outside of the knee, or again, that inside of the knee, even if it's more towards the back, it doesn't necessarily matter, because what we often find is that those mechanical sensations or those dysfunctions are just an expression of the same root dysfunction. So essentially, you don't necessarily need to know or be able to pinpoint where it clicks. You don't necessarily have to understand why it's there specifically. But if you have a broader understanding that the way that you're loading that area isn't perfect, you can use the ball to go hunting for those dysfunctions yourself, while also working on the broader stuff, which again we'll get to. So for most people, I think you'll find that if your knee clicks, you'll have a lot of tightness through the ITB area as it attaches into that kneecap or into that lateral knee. And if your kneecap clicks, or if you click toward the outside of the knee, getting a ball or a foam roller and jamming it into the outside of the knee. So again, we're not necessarily on the top of the knee, we're not on the direct outside of the knee, we're almost on a 45-degree angle between the two. And what we want to get you to do is placing that on the ground. We want to get you to gently find a spot that feels a little bit tight and stiff. So again, what we've talked about a lot on the channel is the best way to make change here isn't to roll around. And for a lot of people, this can be quite tender, which is completely understandable if that area is a bit overloaded or being asked to do something that it's not quite used to do because of the ankle and the hip. But what I want you guys to do is, once you've found a really juicy spot, which again may not be hard, you've got two options. The first option is to literally just stay here, let the ball sink in. If it's really sore, you can tense the muscle over the top, so you can squeeze your quads, squeeze your hamstrings, ask the area to tighten up, and then when you relax a little bit, the ball will sink in a little bit deeper. It'll feel a fraction less tight, a fraction less tender, and you can keep repeating that cycle until you feel like it's freed up enough to see a difference in your clicking. The other way to do this, which I find is probably a little bit more faster acting, is once you find a part of the thigh in this area that feels a bit tender and tight. And normally I would have my foot over the top here, but obviously it's hard to see when I do this. But we want to find a spot that feels tight. Then we want to use movements to sort of shear free that tightness. So again, this isn't for the faint-hearted. Again, I'm using a lacrosse ball. If this is really tender for you, please use a tennis ball. Use a softer ball on a softer surface if you feel like it is too intense. But the point here is that we're finding these tight spots, tacking them down with a ball or a foam roller or whatever you've got lying around. And then we're using movement to shear free that tissue from underneath the ball. And it's these adhesions or this restriction that we often find is sort of the handbrake that causes a lot of the mechanical dysfunction associated with clicking. So again, this exercise is a really, really powerful one because wherever you place it, so again, you've got to go hunting for yourself. If you put it on a spot that feels tight and stiff or tender, use movement to shear that free, then all of a sudden it'll get easier and you're creating more space and more mechanical freedom through these tissues, and they're less likely to click immediately. Obviously, the more you do it, the better it'll get. But we also want to use this for other areas around the knee as well. So for example, a lot of people tend to get quite tight up in the calf muscle as it attaches up into the knee. So again, if we place the ball in that area, now obviously this time what we're doing is we can't necessarily bend the knee in this capacity as much, but what you can do is bend and flex your foot. So we're still getting some tension through the inner sort of upper calf, and we're using the motion of the ankle to shear free that tightness through there. Again, it's a little bit awkward to bend the knee, but we can do the same thing through the outside of the calf. So just below the knee joint, this is often a hot spot for a lot of people in terms of being quite tight. So again, find a spot that feels a little bit tight, a little bit tender, and then use that movement to shear that tissue free. And then what's really important to do with this, and I urge everyone to do this, structure it in this way, is that make sure you do some squats beforehand or do a movement that you know generates that clicking through the knee or anything close to what you would find or what's brought you to this video, to be honest. Get a strong sense of how it feels, how it sounds, how it moves before you do this exercise. Do the exercise and the variations of this exercise, and then redo the exact same movement that you did before so that you can gauge exactly what's changed in your movements, in your sensations from doing this. So again, for me personally, just doing this right leg, I didn't necessarily test it out completely, but for me, who doesn't have a knee that clicks at the moment, it feels more mobile and it feels looser than it did before. So you guys deserve the exact same thing to happen for you. And you can do that with something as simple as a ball or a foam roller. So as I said, by far and away, one of the most effective ways to mobilize the tissue that's restricted that leads to mechanical clicking and cracking that seems to be there. And again, what you'll hopefully understand by doing this is that if you've been worried about arthritis and degeneration causing that, or at least the clicking is a symptom of, or a sign that maybe something's not great in the knee, you can hopefully allay those fears quite quickly by freeing up that tissue and seeing that it doesn't click anymore. Again, it doesn't suggest that you don't have arthritis, but it does suggest that that arthritis isn't the cause of that clicking and cracking, for example. So again, symptomatic exercise is really important. But as always, these videos aren't complete until we talk about the broader cause. And we touched on that earlier before, where we're talking about restrictions at the ankle, restrictions at the hip, excuse me, and some weakness or some decreased muscle control at the hip really allows the knee to wobble in and out a lot more than it should, as opposed to being a set of pistons that sort of stay on some tracks and move up and down in a linear fashion without that sort of rotation or that dumping inward. So again, we want to try and make these positions easy for you guys to manage. And one of the best ways to get the ankle looser, we've done this before with the banded ankle stretch. And all it is for anyone who's new is that you want to place a band, a power band around the ankle. And again, hopefully you can see this. So it's just above the ankle bone. You want to stretch it out as far as you feel comfortable so that the band's pulling directly behind you. And then you want to bend that knee as far as you feel comfortable, just before that heel wants to come up. Now, the key to this, just to show you from the front, if I'm off to the side here, again, imagine that the band's pulling back. The key is that if you run into some ankle restriction, your knee's going to want to start to cave inwards to find a path, a functional path around that restriction. So if you're stretching the ankle, if you're taking the time to do this exercise, you've got to make sure that your foot stays straight, which again, I'm not sure if you can see here. The foot has to stay straight and the knee has to be out as wide as you feel you can go while the band's pulling behind you. Again, you'll find that you won't go as far into the stretch in this position as you will when you're in this position, but that's the point. We don't want to shy away from that stiffness. We want to maintain this position for a couple of minutes, a minute or two, depending on what you feel comfortable with. But again, from this position where the band's pulling backwards. And again, what this does is when you're squatting, retest your squat, and you'll hopefully feel straight away that the side that you stretched has more freedom to move and less capacity to want to dump in, particularly when you get to the end range of your squat. where you feel like you get to this point and the knee doesn't want to dump inwards, it wants to stay out without your heel lifting and without your foot turning out. So the banded ankle stretch is number one. And again, we have a video on that goes into more detail, and I'll link it up here if I can. Now, the second exercise that we're trying to do to solve these issues revolves around hip external rotation and creating that external rotation to allow the knee to function from a better position. So again, we've done a number of different stretches for this, but one of my favorites is just the basic pigeon stretch. Again, I'll do it on the floor, but the idea is that you can do this anywhere. Choose a bench if you can't quite get down on the floor and do this. Do it on a bed. Do it anywhere that you can just throw your leg up. But it's essentially an externally rotated stretch. So essentially how it looks, particularly for me, again, if you can see this, is we want that leg to dump out to the side and again, create that external rotation. If you can get your knee flat, so your shin's basically resting on the ground, that's perfect. If not, that's fine. You want to try and keep your back straight if you can. You don't want to be bending over because it takes out the specificity of the stretch to the hip. And then what we want to do here is we want to make sure that you're feeling some tightness through those glutes. And again, if you're up here, that's fine. You're looking more so for the stretch than completing this position. The depth doesn't matter. We just want to expose what feels tight for you. And again, if you're doing this on a bench or a table, then obviously I'd be standing in this position. But what we want to get you to do here is you can twist towards your knee a little bit. You can twist towards your foot a little bit. You can go forward. Go looking for the position that gives you the best stretch. And then what we want to do when you get here is we want to squeeze those glutes, squeeze that tight spot. Wherever it feels tight for you, give it a tense for about 5 to 10 seconds. This gets your brain involved. This is that PNF or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation or contract, relax, stretching, depending on where you're from. So again, squeezing for 5 seconds and then relax. And then you should find that you can drop down deeper into the stretch than you could before. And this is a really good one because what this does, and again, do it on this leg, you should find that when you squat down again, that leg should travel out further than the other one does. So for me, my right leg goes to here at the moment, which feels a little bit tighter than this one. It just seems to have more range of motion because I literally just stretched that position on the ground. So again, it gives us a chance to put that knee in a better position, stop all the tightened structures from retightening, and again, to get rid of that clicking for good. Now, the fourth and final exercise revolves around trying to get those hips stronger. So again, you can just do basic squats if you want to, where you've got your feet straight and you're screwing those knees out and trying to maintain that whilst you're squatting down to whatever depth you feel comfortable doing, making sure that those knees don't wobble in at all, that they're basically locked into a strong position and you're hinging on top of that. Or if you want to ramp it up, you can grab these booty bands, these hip bands that people tend to love, and place these above your knees, excuse me. And again, a lot of people tend to talk about glute strength in terms of doing clams and sort of hip abduction exercises. Now, while these exercises are great at strengthening specific parts of your hip, they're not functional exercises. They're not exercises that travel, I guess, or translate really well to being a human being. They do just make you better at doing those specific movements, which we don't necessarily do a lot of in isolation day to day. It's potentially much better to do it in the form of a squat, because then we know that squatting movements are very common throughout the day, whether you're going up and down stairs, getting on and off a chair, getting on and off the ground, running, all these sorts of things sort of have very similar analogous shapes that you're required to be in. So it makes sense to do this in a squat. So how this effectively looks again is nothing fancy, but I do like the band around the knee because for those who tend to dump inwards, you have to try and fight to keep the tension on the band, stop those knees from caving in. And if you're doing it correctly, you should feel like there's a little bit of tension through your butt cheeks. So we want to make sure that your feet are straight, those knees are rotated out, and again, you're just dropping down as deep as you feel comfortable without letting those knees come in, without letting the band win, essentially. So again, high repetitions of that. Add some load on your back if it gets too easy, but the goal is basically to strengthen the muscles that externally rotate your hips and hold you in a good position. So again, it sounds like a lot of things to do for just something as maybe innocuous as knees that click, but hopefully it speaks to the broader context where whether you've got knee pain, arthritic knees, or just knees that make weird sounds, all of those symptoms are an expression of some broader dysfunction that's going on with you. So even if your knees click but they don't hurt, it's very likely you've got similar dysfunction going on there with your ankles and your hips and potentially your back as well, which we didn't even get to. There's similar potential dysfunction there between you guys and people that have genuine knee pain. It's just that your tissues haven't necessarily got to that point yet, and they may never get there, but they haven't breached that threshold where your body can no longer tolerate that dysfunction. So it's well worth taking the time to definitely go after the knee clicks and the symptoms associated with the knee, but it's also a really good opportunity to take a step back and say, right, are my ankles stiff even though they don't hurt? Are my hips a bit tight even though they don't hurt? And how strong am I, and how well am I able to keep my knees in a good position when doing basic things throughout the day? And that obviously goes up another level if you're someone who's athletic, who enjoys running or cycling or anything sort of that requires more of your legs. But the conversation's the same. It's just different ends of the spectrum based on who you are and what you do. So again, hopefully that was useful. Again, if you found it useful, please let me know in the comments below. Let me know what you think about these ideas and how they work for you. Leave us a like if you enjoyed the video, and again, consider subscribing if you want to join in. We've got a long journey ahead of us. Hopefully we're going to reach a lot of people. So with that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.